What's going on YouTube? My name is Newo, and I'm a techno artist from Los Angeles. Today I'll be doing a video that is slightly different than my usual content. I will not be doing a sound design tutorial or providing insight into the scene of sorts. What I will be discussing is a case study or track breakdown of Cardboard City by Sian. Sian is the label head of Octopus Recordings, which is an independent techno label here in Los Angeles. And he is just one of the most original out right now, at least in my opinion, and I think the opinions of many. I mean, he is someone who's pushing the bounds not only with the mix downs of his records, with the arrangements of his records, with his DJ sets, but just how you can be an artist in this genre. He's really just pushing originality. He's really transparent with his fans, and that's something I really look up to. I wanted to discuss this specific track by Sian because it was the track that I heard a while ago that just changed everything. And when I say changed everything, I mean, how do you come up with something like this? How and why is this such an effective piece of music? You know, I found this record when it was released as a free download on Mixmag as part of a promotional run for his second album, I believe, which is Capital Crime Wave, which was released a few years ago. And by the way, check out his album X as well, his more recent release. But I wanted to discuss a couple things like the drums, the bass, you know, the overall production, the mix down. So let's just dive into it. For sake of example, I'm going to play you a little bit of the record. This record just has that like throbbing, relentless rhythm, even though it's on the slower side. I mean, it's 122 beats per minute, but I personally feel it has a faster feel to it. It feels almost like 125. Now, the first thing I wanted to talk about is the drums, right? And why is this track effective? Why are the drums so effective? And part of that is obviously the kick drum, right? But if you listen to the kick drum, it actually has a lot more, I guess, knock on it. It's not like a really subby kick. It's not a really boomy kick. It's a very tight kick. And I believe if we go into eighth notes, you'll be able to see that, right? The kick drum is pretty much an eighth note. I mean, some of this, because it's the master of the record, you're seeing the bass line come through as well. But the meat of the kick drum is very short. And that allows the bass line to really cut through nicely. With a tight kick drum like that, a very punchy kick drum, it does its job in the mix. It does its job of holding down as the backbone and not distracting the listener. But also, if you were to have muted it, you would definitely notice it, right? And that's the other thing too, is like the kick, it's definitely loud, but it's not like mixed too loud, if that makes sense. Like it has enough top end on it that it cuts through on smaller speakers. So let's listen to the bass line specifically. And to get a better idea of that, why don't we put an EQ on it and just cut out all of the top end? So we'll just hear the sub of it. Now you'll hear it's only a couple notes, right? It's a very simple loop and it's so hypnotic. That is the main thing I want you guys to take away from this. And that's why I love Sian, because he's just so good at coming up with these hypnotic rhythms that lock you in. And you don't even realizing, I mean, the track could be 10 minutes long. You don't even realize you're listening to the same thing over and over because it's just so satisfying, right? And it gets you into like a trance almost. Let's do the opposite on that bass. And you'll see what I mean in just a moment. So let's cut out all of the sub of the bass and just listen to the top end, almost as if we were listening on our phone or on laptop speakers. Now you still hear it come through. And why do you still hear it come through? Well, my guess, and I'm thinking I'm right with his production process. I obviously, haven't seen him work in the studio or anything, but just from what I'm hearing, there's a sort of distortion on it, and it sounds almost like a guitar amp. And that could be something that's done in parallel or just on the actual channel, but it almost feels like it's being played by an actual bass guitar. And that sort of distortion when you're producing records is a great way to trick the listener's ears into both making the bass sound louder, but also making it cut through on smaller systems, on smaller speakers. And it allows you to harmonically saturate the bass so you can do more with less. And what I mean by that is it's such a simple pattern that the distortion and the saturation of that guitar pedal kind of fills in the blanks, if that makes sense. And so already from the jump, just that kick and bass, it's so powerful. And there too. So you hear those little claps come in at the end of the sequence, right? Because this would be 4 bars. And so at the very end, that's a trick that I use quite often, and I'm really glad to hear it in this record. And that was something I borrowed that from this record initially, is signaling to the listener that something's coming. And a little simple clap like that, a double clap, is a great way to tell the listener, like, hey, if you stuck around for those couple bars, let's keep you engaged with some new elements that are going to come in. And those new elements would be... Now, if you listen to the hi-hats, right, they're not a traditional techno hi-hat. They're a softer sound. They don't have as much of a transient on them. They almost sound like sleigh bells or something. And there's something playing alongside that. So it's that on each kick drum. It's not necessarily a hi-hat either. It's a high frequency sound, but it could be a sample or something. But that is a perfect way to get the energy up and just kind of signal to the listener that the overall vibe, the foundation that we have introduced, is going to keep building. So then from there, what he does... So there's that obviously that clap or the snare. And it almost sounds like more of a snare at this point. But it's not just that. It's a hook in itself, because there's like the dun 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 dun. It's like a call and response almost. And so that sort of push and pull call and response is within these first couple bars of the record. It's already telling the listener, like, hey, if you're hooked on this part, just wait till you hear what's coming, because what comes next, another one of those little, signals that the end of the sequence is happening, and it's a higher frequency sound, so it really stands out from the bass line and the kick. But then right there, the hook of the record, that sort of metallic, almost like spring type of sound. And what's crazy is after years of listening to this record, I realized like that sound doesn't really have a lot of low end on it. Like, let's bring that EQ back, right? So that spring type of sound, that hook that comes always throughout the track, it's really sitting in the like 500, 1K range. I mean, it might even go down to like 300, but there's definitely no sub frequencies on it, and it doesn't need it, because there's already such a solid foundation with the kick drum and with the bass line that it's another one of those things that he's tricking the listener's ear. So he's making it sound like it has a lot of bass because the harmonics in the low end are being filled in already. And the type of sound, that sort of like distorted, springy bass, I mean, you hear that a lot in like drum and bass music and different styles of electronic music. Our ears associate that with low frequency. So even though it's only playing high frequency, we're kind of conditioned after listening to enough electronic music for those types of sounds, we register them as bass. And so this is really where the genius of the overall record comes in, is just how hypnotic this actually is. And like I already discussed, some of those elements are already, they're still in there. They're consistent throughout the record. So those 4 on the floor style high frequency sound, and the softer hi-hat as well. And then we go into the break. And all of those established sounds are playing except for the kick drum. I'm not 100% sure. I mean, I would love one day to be able to see the session file and how he actually did this, but it almost sounds Maybe I'm mistaken, but it almost sounds like the high frequency of the bass comes through more, but maybe that's just because there's some sidechain happening with the kick drum. But it's a perfect place to put the break because right here, that's 32 bars, right? And so the listener at that point is already locked in. The message of the track, the main message, has already been sent out to the listener. And so they have been grooving to it enough to the point on the dance floor where it's like, okay, let's shift gears slightly, but further build upon that already established concept, right? So then right here, what happens is he brings in some new sounds and further develops on that initial idea, further elaborating on that message to the listener, because music at the end of the day, I always say this, it is a message. And think of, okay, a draft of your record as like a message that you've written out by hand, right? And then once it gets to the final mix down stage and the record is approaching completion, you want to have that handwriting as easily readable by anyone as possible so that it can get interpreted by as many people as possible. And you know, the next chapter, I guess, in this message that Sian is telling the listeners is these new sounds. So there's like wah 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 wah. Those get introduced right there, and it's the perfect way to bring them in, because if you had brought those in anywhere over here, it would overwhelm the listener. And on top of that, you'll not only hear those, but you'll hear another call and response. So that sort of glitch sound, that like dun, 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 dun. So that's acting almost like a counter melody. In the style of minimal, it's really cool to be able to do like a melody out of something that's not a melody. It's like a riff almost, and creating riffs out of sounds that aren't necessarily melodic sounds. And it works really well because the main sound in this track, that consistent springy bass sound, it doesn't really have a melody to it. So you want to have some sort of ear candy around that sound. It's not the main character in the story, but it's a supporting actor, where if that supporting actor was not in the film would not make sense, right? So that sound gets introduced and that counter melody continues. And then going back to the arrangement, so part of the clap comes out because there's that main like clap. It's more like a snare, but then and actually that's a perfect example of what I was going to talk about right now. Is there's a couple layers to that main snare clap, whatever you want to call it, that's on the 2 and the 4, because you start to hear that background sound here. Right there, it's more like a rim shot, and if you listen, it's mixed extremely low, so that when the main clap comes in, it thickens it, right? And I'm willing to bet you those are not all playing at the exact same millisecond as each other, because it's a very thick sound. And what I'm guessing Sian did is shifted things ever so slightly, so like if you zoom in enough, it's probably coming in not exactly on the transient. On the line of the bar. It's coming in at slightly different times so that it's tricking the ear into sounding bigger than it actually is. And then we get to this other breakdown, right? And that little rim shot, it continues there to hold that rhythm, to hold your head bobbing still. Because again, we're still building tension, right? The record is still building in terms of the supporting actors and everything like that. So when it comes back, there's a ride introduced, and those other less intense hi-hats are still playing underneath it, but that ride, it just further picks up the energy in the record as it comes back. And then here we have a tonal difference in the hi-hats versus. And so that's kind of the thing of like why this record is so effective, because even though it may sound like a simple loop, it's so much more complicated than that. And that's kind of the genius behind the minimal style, is like how much can you do with only a limited amount. And it really comes down to things like those tonal differences in the hi-hats, those call and response types of melodic sounds or melodic sounding sounds, right? So then we'll go into the next break. And this is where it gets really simple. It's, it's not really much percussion or anything. And those quacky kind of sounds continue, but that's just to hold tension still. And those continue throughout. And what you'll hear right there too is that sort of like sweeping sound. I mean, obviously there's some effects, white noise type of effects in here, but it kind of simulates that like DJ sweep that you would do with the filter knob. And that's also what gives it a very live feel. It kind of makes it sound like it's being played live already. And so my favorite part too is like when it comes back, because that rhythm and that message is already so established up until this point, he's able to bring it back into the drop without the hook sound. So there's not that metallic, springy sound that is the main part of the record. It's actually, you're able to get away with not having it here. And I think if you did have it here, it would actually overwhelm the listener. It would come back too strong. And so that's why he waits like, what is that, like 16 bars? And then brings it in after that main groove that's already been established. You're able to like breathe with that for a second, and then that comes back. And so it continues until like the hi-hats get stripped out and it becomes more of just a straight bounce it's more open. And this part of the record is really where it becomes the next record in the DJ set would be starting to be brought in right here. And what's cool about this record too, though, is like it kind of has that DJ Tool vibe. So even if you wanted to, you could just loop this little part of it and tease it in a set. Because it's so open, you could bring it on top of really any other source material. Just some things to think about. I mean, I could go on all day about why I love Sian and why I think he's so just, his approach is so fantastic with all of this. But sticking to that concept of minimalism, it's really about like keeping things interesting, but also you don't want to move things too fast. So like you're able to have sections that, it's just a very locked in groove and you don't have to do too much for a certain part, but you can't just have the whole record be one loop. And it comes down to those little differences in, the hi-hats, in the bass line with the distortion, things like that. And that's actually what I want to talk about too, is with the arrangement. Like you'll hear the bass line gets a lot thinner there, almost as if like you had cut out the lows on the DJ mixer. But what's nice is the kick drum is still bumping. So, you could even loop that little part if you wanted, or even like make an edit. Like you could really use that to make an edit of this track if you wanted to just shift around the arrangement for your own style of DJing. But I don't know. I just wanted to share this today with you guys and let me know your thoughts on both this record, on both, your thoughts of Sian as an artist. And if there's a specific track by a specific artist that you would like me to kind of analyze and talk about why it's so effective, let me know. Let me know who your favorite artists are. Let me know who your favorite labels are. And, let's definitely talk music and discuss why we like the things that we like, right? So thank you very much for checking out today's video. Definitely go download this track. I don't know if it's still available as a free download on Mixmag, but yeah, have a great rest of your day. Thank you.